Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take your seats, the star of the show would like to perform here. Yeah, please take your seats. Welcome to this very special event, ladies and gentlemen. We have a number of celebrities in our midst, so try and spot who they are. Yeah, I won't be naming them. It seems almost redundant that I have to sit here and introduce our speaker author today. Yeah, so I'll be very, very brief. Yeah, since all of you probably know more about Justice Bokhary than I do. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, when we think of the Hong Kong judiciary, some people are just larger than life. Yeah, and I think Justice Bokhary is one of them. Yeah, it's something like Lord Denning of England, Michael Kirby of Australia, Justice Krishna Iyer of India. These people somehow are just larger than life. Yeah, and with that, yeah, I shall leave our author speaker today to tell us something about his book, himself, and whatever else he may choose to say. Yeah, and he'll take questions and answers at the end, and of course there'll be the book signing ceremony after the proceedings. Yeah, Justice Bokhary.
Democracy is a subject near and dear to my heart, and also to yours, I have no doubt. Let us begin our consideration of it by noting that it is a human instinct upon which the continued existence of humankind depends to form families. Not surprisingly, the Universal Declaration states that the family is the natural and fundamental group of society and is entitled to protection by the state. In due course, the ICCPR added that such protection is also due from society. In addition to forming families, human beings, with the exception of hermits, I suppose, naturally gravitate towards gathering in communities consisting of persons who are related and persons who are not. The reasons are simple enough. One is that we enjoy each other's company. Another is that it makes for mutual support and protection, which is a lesson of law, of history, of anthropology, of archaeology, and of paleontology. As to that, there is the example of the Neanderthal Man, officially designated the Shenandoah 1 Neanderthal, popularly known by the nickname Nandi. Nandi's remains were discovered in Shenandoah in Iraq in 1957, some 40,000 years after his death in a rock fall. An examination of his remains disclosed three things. First, that he died at the age of around 40. Secondly, that he had been born in a physical condition which would have made him a burden to the community of mobile hunters and gatherers to which he belonged. Thirdly, that his community must have cared for him all his life, from his infancy to the time of his accidental death when he was well into adulthood. The advantages of living in a community are perhaps best illustrated by how the earliest transgressors within a community were dealt with. They were dealt with by permanent banishment from the community and into situations in which survival was very much in doubt. A recent and humane example is afforded by the practice in Hunza in Pakistan, once a princely state within that country. In Hunza, offenders were not imprisoned, but simply banished for a few years to a less hospitable valley. For all its advantages, community life has a drawback. The creation of a collectivity unavoidably impacts upon the personal autonomy of each individual forming it. And this is especially so when it amounts to organized society, ultimately a nation state, with all its complexities. Everywhere, or at least almost everywhere, people's lives are nowadays highly regulated by rules and requirements imposed by the state. Mr. Justice Cummins made the point amusingly and effectively by posing the question, what licenses and permissions would Noah need now in order to run the ark? So the benefits of living in organized society have to be paid for by an acceptance of a diminution of personal autonomy. One of the functions of human rights is to ensure that the price is not too high. Democracy is a particularly important human right, so much so that, as Mr. Justice Black, speaking for the United States Supreme Court, said in the case of Westbury and Saunders, other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. At this stage, I should say what I mean by human rights and what I mean by democracy. As I see human rights in today's world, they represent the minimum which people everywhere are entitled to demand for themselves and must accord to others so that we may all live and let live as human beings, enjoying the maximum personal autonomy consistent with life in organized society. These entitlements, unified by principles of justice, involve civil liberties, personal security, security of property, however modest, self-expression, public participation, respect for otherness, education, healthcare, and at least a tolerable standard of living. They enable each and every one of us to be ourselves and to live and let live with human dignity in how we treat others and are treated by them. These are the things in which humankind, emerging from the horrors of the Second World War, put its faith as the surest means of attaining and preserving world peace and worldwide justice. This is evidenced by the adoption in 1948 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the entry into it thereafter of so many human rights treaties, general and specific. You will have noticed that I mentioned public participation as a human right. Such participation goes to democracy. Baroness Kennedy pointed out in her book Just Laws that rights are indispensable to democracy, and vice versa, we in Hong Kong have to add. As I understand democracy, it requires that the executive and the legislature be formed by free and fair elections through universal suffrage and secret ballot. Essentially representative, through elected representatives, democracy can occasionally be direct, typically by referendum. Hong Kong has not resorted to referendums, but public consultations are to some extent a feature of governance here, and provided that public opinion is heeded, such consultation bears some resemblance to direct democracy. Everywhere in the world, from the moment they began to form groups, people have endeavored, with varying degrees of success, to find some means by which to have a say in whom should lead their group and have some influence in how their leaders behave. Some of these endeavors have been rudimentary, others more sophisticated. Examples including Athenian democracy, the election of the caliphs in ancient Arabia, and the move in Britain from absolute to constitutional monarchy. This is not an occasion for going into the details of any of these endeavors, whether rudimentary or sophisticated here or elsewhere in the world. Let us focus on Hong Kong. Although Hong Kong has human rights, and although democracy is a human right, it is typically provided for in the structural provisions of constitutions rather than in the rights and freedoms provisions of constitutions. To this, our constitution, the Basic Law, is no exception. Article 45 of the Basic Law states that the ultimate aim is the selection of chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. That is a promise of universal suffrage, but one which is qualified by the provision for nomination by a committee not formed by universal suffrage. The extent of this qualification is a matter often debated. I will not go into that on this occasion. In regard to the matter of forming the Executive Council, Article 68(2) of the Basic Law states that it shall be specified in light of the actual situation in Hong Kong and in accordance with the principle of gradual and orderly progress, and that the ultimate aim is the election of all the members of the Legislative Council by universal suffrage. The promise of universal suffrage remains wholly unfulfilled as far as the selection of the chief executive is concerned. As far as the election of the Legislative Council is concerned, the promise of universal suffrage can perhaps be said to be half fulfilled. Half of the constituencies are geographical. They return legislators through universal suffrage, but the other half, essentially functional constituencies, do not. Their constituents include organizations and corporations as well as individuals. At the moment, the process of democratic development in Hong Kong is at a standstill. Sadly, it has ground to a halt. There are bitter accusations and equally bitter counter-accusations as to why that happened and who is to blame. Let us leave the question of blame to one side. The obvious fact is that the process is in urgent need of a restart. Nothing less than the success of the one country, two systems principle is at stake. The rule of law is an integral element of our system preserved under that principle. In the absence of full democracy, the rule of law can prevail under certain conditions only, and even then, under those conditions, only for a limited span of time. Time was perhaps on our side when I first said that in the year 2010. The matter has become far more urgent since then. As it seems to me, the prospects of achieving something meaningful are considerably better in regard to the election of legislative councillors than in regard to the selection of chief executive. Unlike the selection of the chief executive, the election of legislative councillor does not involve a nominating committee. It is true, as we have seen, that Article 68(2) speaks of gradual and orderly progress. That sort of qualification is more common in relation to the realization of socioeconomic rights involving large-scale expenditure than in realization of civil and political rights. and democracy is a human right of a civil and political nature. Nevertheless, the word gradual is there, but how gradual is it supposed to be? After all, we are already almost halfway through the period of 50 years from 1997 to 2047. So where do we go from here and now? Dwelling on the past is hardly purposeful, but studying the past can be instructive. So is assessing what type of measures of democratic development is within the realms of practical possibility. So for that purpose, it is worthwhile looking at where we have been in the past as far as democracy is concerned. The British era in Hong Kong began in 1841. By 1843, by an exercise of prerogative power, the legislature, then as now called the Legislative Council, was created for Hong Kong. For a very long time thereafter, membership of the Legislative Council was either ex officio, by virtue of a senior post in the colonial legal service, or unofficial, upon appointment by the governor. Apart from being appointed rather than elected, the unofficial members were in a minority. These unofficials included good people, but their presence on the Legislative Council did not entail democracy. It only reflected the government's interests in local opinion and output and input. Election to the Legislative Council called direct when it by a functional constituency and indirect by when a functional constituency and direct by a geographical constituencies. The first election to the Legislative Council took place in 1985. Do you remember, Martin? But it was an urgent, indirect election entirely. No direct election took place until 1991. In this context, I means through universal suffrage, and therefore democratic. Indirect means otherwise than through universal suffrage, and therefore, to speak plainly, undemocratic. Such were their electorates that functional constituencies returned legislative councils otherwise than through anything remotely resembling universal suffrage. That is again how they are now. But there was a time between then and now when functional constituencies were not like that. That was when the electoral reforms introduced by Governor Patton in 1994 were in force before being dismantled upon the handover. Governor Patton may have wanted to make every legislative council constituency a geographical one, but that was not an option open to him. Even by 1994, the letters patent had not been enhanced beyond providing for 20 legislative councillors returned by geographical constituencies, 30 by functional constituencies, and 10 by an election committee. Essentially, the patent electoral reforms lowered the voting age, altered and expanded the electorates of the functional constituencies, and improved the election committee. Consequently, everybody in Hong Kong who attained the age of 18 was able to vote for a legislative councillor. Even though election by functional constituencies remained indirect in form, universal suffrage in substance had come to the Legislative Council elections. It has since gone. But the case for bringing it back, both in substance and form, seems to me to be overwhelming, especially bearing in mind that the Basic Law promises it. Speaking at the Conference on Women's Rights held in 1848 in Seneca Falls in New York, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, in the course of demanding that women given the right to vote, famously voiced a protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed. Some of my grandchildren live in Hong Kong. I very much hope, that in time they will live in a fully democratic Hong Kong. Whether, and if so how, you choose to campaign for the fulfillment of the promise to Hong Kong of democracy is a matter for each of you to decide for yourself. But whatever choice you may make, I earnestly bid you, always to behave peaceably and with respect for the law. It is a constitutional promise. There must be a constitutional way in which to seek its fulfillment. Thank you very much. I will take questions, preferably leading questions which suggest the answer, but if not, any question.